five pictured here, but three were musicians and two were ministers. One was my grandmother, who was the one in the middle on the front row. She was a musician, of course, and then she had three children, one of which was my mother, who was also a musician. And then my mother and father, as I shared on last night, had six children, three older children and three younger. That's my mother and father down in the left corner over there. And my older brothers and sisters were singing as a trio before we were born. As soon as I could talk, I was put into the group. So that little person over there singing around the mic with his eyes on his hands, that's me. So literally, you know, you say, yeah, I started singing this. Yeah, right. Here's the picture. Oh, my God, it's true, right? So at any rate, we started singing. So started very, very early. And as I said, my great aunt, Pauline Wells Lewis, who was the picture of the five, the lady on the front row, the short lady on the left, she was a pioneering radio announcer in the 40s and 50s. And this is when gospel music was just starting. Gospel music is not old music. It was starting in the late 30s and 40s, and it wasn't accepted in most of the churches, all right, because it was a little too bluesy and jazzy. But at any rate, the way that they decided to move this music out was to develop what they called the Gospel Highway, a network of places where people could perform and sing and eat and stay and travel. And my aunt was a part of that network. She was a promoter as well as a radio announcer in gospel music in the 40s and 50s. So she sponsored the concerts of all of these people, you know, Rosetta Tharpe and Mahalia Jackson and the Clara Ward singers and Shirley Caesar and James Cleveland and Thomas Jordan, all of these folks. And so because my family sang, we actually got to sing and open up on all of these concert programs for all these artists. So, you know, we were just singing. I didn't think anything about it. And it wasn't until later that I realized that this was really a big deal. These were like the pioneers in gospel music. So we grew up doing that. So it was nothing to be connected with gospel music. Friday after school, we'd be on the road, we'd be traveling all weekend long, singing all weekend long, back in time for school on Monday, and we'd go. We were kind of like, I say, kind of like a gospel Jackson 5, you know, if you can imagine. Just singing and recording and all of that. So, you know, as I shared on yesterday, I went through doing all this music and singing and playing and recording, and people just impressed, at least this was back in the 60s, early 70s, that doing music was not a real career. And, you know, you shouldn't do that, so I decided not to do that, but I went to school. And I decided I was going to major in music. And as I shared the challenge with classical music and gospel music for years, there had been this conflict for many, many reasons. And we'll talk about some of those in a little bit. But at any rate, what it did is it burned into me a vision that people need to learn about African-American music and learn how to perform it and learn about its history in academic settings and not be made to feel it's inferior. So that started me on this trek to develop methodology and pedagogy and all these things to help people access this music, especially those who did not come from the African-American gospel tradition. So that has been my life for the last 40 years, and I'm excited about that. But at any rate, that's how I came to this, how I came into this gospel music piece in the academy and sharing it with many others. So we'll talk a little bit about this a little more, but I'm now going to move over and start talking about the history of African-American sacred music. So we're about to go on a journey, so pack your bags and let's get ready. There's a whole lot to do, and as I said, I'm going to share as much as I can, because when you look at African-American music, African-American culture, period, many times people do not understand it appropriately because all of the factors that make it what it is are not always considered. So I'm going to try to give you as much as I can. So you're in my class now. You're in A496 at Indiana University, and you're going to get the whole lecture here, really. So let's go. All right, so let's start with a couple of questions, first of all, and we can make these rhetorical just for the sake of time's sake. But by the end, you should be able to answer these questions. So, are gospel songs and spirituals the same? Are they the same? I got to know. That's for sure? How many say no? How many say yes? How many say, I don't know? You're the teacher, tell us. All right. All right. So, well, gospel and spirituals are not the same, all right? They are 2 of 7 distinct African-American sacred genres. We've got psalmody, line singing, shape note singing, spirituals, hymnody, gospel songs, and the standard classical art forms in which African-Americans compose. But they're often confused because they share common musical elements. Now, so those are the sacred musical genres. We're going to talk about each and every one of them as we go through our lecture here. Think about this. What was the invisible church? What do scholars consider the first American music to develop? How did the spiritual evolve? What is or what was the Azusa movement? What were the 5 musical forms that merged to form gospel music? Who was the father of gospel music? Who was Richard Allen? What is the historical pattern that occurs in gospel music? What was the first crossover gospel song? Now, certainly I could keep asking more and more questions, but those are some things that I want you to kind of put in your mind. And as we go through, hopefully, you'll gain some of this information and you'll kind of walk away, with some more tools in your tool belt, feeling really equipped and like you really know some great things about this music. So, let's get started. Now, from the moment the first group of African Americans arrived on the shores of America in 1619, through to the present, African Americans have contributed significantly to the growth and advancement of this country while enduring many hardships and challenges. And the ingenuity of African Americans has been responsible for many of the inventions and technological developments in America, and the determination for freedom and justice within the African American community has launched many of the social and political movements for societal change within America. We're looking at that sense of the slave trade and that map on how they came from Africa to America. Now, one of the most significant developments, however, was the establishment of the black church. Whether built literally with invisible walls or real brick and mortar, this institution has produced much and contributed greatly to help sustain the black community through both good and bad times. Now, through preaching, blacks could hear a word of encouragement to face another day. Through praying, blacks received strength and remained hopeful that God would provide divine intervention and help in every situation. By gathering and interacting, blacks created a community that could both understand and share their individual and through the music, blacks were able to find and keep a song in their hearts that allowed them to make it through any trial. Now, let me share this while I'm at it. I normally have my notes right here, and I'd be looking straight ahead more at you, but there's this wonderful, big words right in front of me. So I'm looking up, not because I'm ignoring you, but because the words are right there, and I've looked at this little screen. So you know that when the eyes start going crazy, you start getting to that age when you can't do it with the glasses. That is big, so I'm going to look up there, right? So just want to give you that. Now, so the objective of our lecture today is to consider the historical development and evolution of African American sacred music and its significance throughout history. So we've got a long way to go, and let's see if we can get started. So to understand African American music, we must consider the role of music in Africa. Music and dance played a significant role in everyday life in Africa. Almost every activity was accompanied by music and dance, and music and dance was used to worship and evoke the presence of God. And everyone in the community played a role. It was a collective communal tradition. Literally, even if you were not the performers, those who were in the community, they would pat along, they would sing along, they would tap, they would shake the shakers or things on their bodies, but everybody played a role. And singing, literally, was what they did. It was what they knew. It was a part of African culture, and singing and music was a part of everyday life. Now, the songs were usually used in African culture to tell the history of the people, and they had professional storytellers called griots who were designed or commissioned literally to capture the songs and the history and the stories of the people, and they were master musicians. They were highly esteemed within their communities, and they told the stories through songs in Africa in a very pastoral manner. And they used the songs to tell the stories, and it would not be new then for the enslaved Africans to also use this principle of using music as a way to tell their stories and to keep their history. So that is something that was retained and that was carried over from the African tradition. And it was a key part of what would become African American tradition as well. Now, to understand African American sacred music, we must also consider the history of slavery in America. And as we then cross over the Atlantic, we must consider that. In 1619, there was a Dutch man who landed on the coast of Virginia, and he brought the first shipment of enslaved Africans, and they came literally from every part of the west coast of Africa, and they came on overcrowded ships, as you see in that diagram, that iconic picture. I was recently in Ghana, West Africa, and had the chance literally to visit all of the various forts and the castles where they literally worked in the slave trade and captured the Africans and brought them through. It was a very, very powerful experience, but I learned quite a bit more about the slave trade. But they came from all of West Africa, and they came on those crowded ships to America. Now, approximately 12 million Africans were captured and brought to America between 1563 and 1863. And the Africans came mostly, as we said, from the west coast of Africa, but they brought with them their music, their dance, their instruments, their language, their cuisine, and all the traditions and all of these things were a vital part of African culture. So singing and music making became an essential part of their existence and response to slavery. Eileen Southern, a wonderful African-American ethnomusicologist, writes, the function of music as a communal activity led to the development of slave song repertoires that provided a measure of release from the physical and spiritual brutality of slavery. So as we talk about African-American sacred music and African-American music in general, we must understand that it is a response to the situations that African-Americans faced and endured in America. Now, just as in many things, African-American culture, the music of the Black church is varied and it's complex. And this is for many reasons. And the primary reason for this variation and complexity is that there was a collision of the African and European cultures. African-American music and worship must be understood based upon a continuum with European culture at one end, African culture at the other end, and a mixture of cultures in between. Southern writes again, the interaction of African and European cultural patterns in Black communities resulted in the emergence of new African-American patterns. The coming together of these two cultures and cultural aesthetics produced a uniquely African-American cultural aesthetic that influenced the music of the Black church. Now, this is very important. Oh, my Africans slid over to the side, but they should be in the middle. When you begin to talk about African-American culture, many people look back and assume that everything is related to Africa. And it is in part, but also when you talk about African-American culture, you've got to understand that when African culture came to America, it collided with European culture. That collision created something new. So consequently, when you look at African-American culture, it is impossible to separate those two because it was the collision. So almost every aspect of African-American culture will be touched in some way by those two cultural components. So African-American music is often misunderstood because we fail to recognize that it's based upon two cultures, right? And understanding this concept alone will provide insight regarding the variety and complexity of African-American sacred music. So often as people hear the music, they go, well, is that African-American music? It sounds like it's Western European music. Well, there is a reason, because as these cultures came together, depending upon how Africans or African-Americans were assimilating into American society, how they were raised, how they were educated, it determines how they then pursued a specific musical style. So there are African-Americans who perform in Western styles, there are African-Americans who perform in styles that are connected to African music, and then there are those who do this combination of both of these things together. So as you look to the music and as you'll see the history, you'll actually now understand why and how African-American sacred music is so varied and so complex. And hopefully this will make the difference in your understanding of all that you see, not just in music, but African-American culture. And let me share this while I'm here. Even amongst African-Americans, sometimes there is a sense that they judge one another or fight with one another because they do not acknowledge that African-American culture is on the continuum. So, for those who may have been educated through a very European Western culture, those who were not will look at them and go, why are you acting this way? Why are you speaking this way? Why are you singing this way? And vice versa, those who were not having the advantage of formal training, others will look at them and go, why are you not talking this way? I was in the barbershop the other day, and there was an African-American young lady who was saying how there's a kind of idiom when people go to the bar or go get their hair done, they say, I'm going to get my hair did. Right? I'm gonna get my hair did. It's just an African colloquial way of saying that. And this is an African-American young say, I hate when people say it that way and they can't talk and they can't speak and they can't da-da-da. Well, clearly she had been trained and had the advantage of studying English in that formal way, and some people have not. So it doesn't mean that they're any less African-American because they've received the formal training or because they have not, but we don't always understand it and recognize that it is a continuum. And African-American culture and music and everything about our culture may exist along that spectrum. While I'm there, let me give you this. This is off the path, so I'm getting into the weeds here. But for many, many years, this is my story. As a musician, I never felt like I fit anywhere. I've been very, very blessed, but I never felt like I fit. I was blessed, I was raised, to work with professional musicians and great recording artists and all kinds of stuff, but it looked like they were doing greater things always. Like, come on, God, I'm with these folks. I grew up with them. I wrote that song. We did work. So it'd be like I'd get a contract, but they get a contract, right? I'd go overseas, but they'd go overseas, right? So it always seemed like they were doing different things. And so there was a gentleman by the name of Dr. Robert Mitchell Simmons, who was the dean of the Academic Division of Gospel Music Worship of America. He moved to Columbus, Ohio, where I was living at the time, and started pastoring a church and teaching at the seminaries. And I was on the faculty of GMWA, Gospel Music Worship of America, for many years, so we connected. I would travel with him and accompany my choir would demonstrate as he lectured on black music. Well, anyway, one day he was talking about cross-cultural music. And he said about back in the day, when two cultures came together, A being dominant culture, B being black culture, it would just be two things in the same room, A, B, B, A. But he said of how the cultures have so mixed that now when they come together, it's neither A nor B. It's something different. And he called that C. And I went away thinking on that, and the Lord spoke to me and said, that's your problem. You're a C. All of my background was gospel. All of my training was European classical. So what was coming out of me was neither one or the other. It was a combination of both. So when I go to the B folks, they go, that's nice, but it's too that. I go to the A folks, they go, that's nice, but it's a little bit too that. I'm like, God, come on. Where do I fit? He says, I'm preparing you for a C world. I need people that speak both languages who could become the bridges to bring people together. So for the last 25, 30 years, once I recognized that, that is who I am. I'm not an A or a B, I'm a C, I'm all of those things. So when we look at African American culture, that's what we have to consider. And that may not resonate with everyone in the room, but I'm talking about music, but that could be anything. You know, raised in the rural area, living in the suburbs, or went to public school, going to school at Harvard. I don't know what the polls are, but often the world tells us you have to fit in a certain box. And sometimes you just don't fit. Because you have been blessed to have the education and the training or exposure in different areas, consequently, ideally, from that divine, ordination place, you are ordained to then be that person with those unique experiences to be able to make a difference in the world. Okay, so that was Reverend Wise. I'm going to stop preaching now. But anyway, so that's very, very important to understand the music as we go through the history. All right. Good. So we talked about how the music of is often misunderstood. It's often misunderstood because it's viewed through the wrong aesthetic perspective. What does that mean? There is actually a European aesthetic perspective, which is very different than the African aesthetic perspective. In fact, they're diametrically opposed. They're totally opposite. So in the African, it would be affective or emotion. The European would be cognitive, rational. The African is loud. The European is soft. The African is movement. The European is stillness. The African is collective art. The European is individual art. The African is generally pentatonic scale. The European is diatonic scale. The African is improvisational. The European is structured. The African is celebrative. The European is ceremonial. So if you look at these distinct things, and then I began to take on a specific lens and aesthetic and view the other culture through the wrong lens, I'm not going to value it. So that is what has happened both ways. When people look at African American culture, they often look at it through the wrong aesthetic lens and therefore do not see the value of the music and do not understand it. So that's the significance of understanding the difference and the distinctions. And sometimes because they're completely opposite and because they were completely opposite, the slave masters in that time did not understand the beauty of what the Africans were doing when they sang and when they danced. When they did all the things that they brought from African culture. And this explains even today why African American culture may not be understood. And when you don't view it correctly, African or African American culture, you will not see the beauty, you will misunderstand the practices, and you may even be afraid. So it's important to understand that. So why was this music and culture misunderstood? When we talk about the music and culture, Africans applied what we call the ecstatic approach to worship. And what that means is basically, in Africa, there was this notion of being filled with the Spirit, connecting with God, touching God. And when they did their music, there was a sense that they would sing and they would become in a place so that they would transcend their human, mundane existence and rise up to be caught up in the Spirit. So this idea of being caught up in the Spirit was misunderstood by the masters in America, and slaves would sing and dance and get caught up in the Spirit. They would often move to this emotional manner that caused fear amongst their slave masters who did not understand the ecstatic approach to worship. The way this worked is as they repeated something over and over and over, they would, after a while, they would get caught up through the repetition, and they would then be in a place where they would feel connected with their God, they would be filled with the Spirit, and that made the masters very, very afraid. So The longer they sang, the more emotional they came. The longer they sang, the freer they came. And they were caught up and filled with the Spirit, and they were freed then from the realities of slavery, if only for a moment. So when you look at the black church and you look at black church music, often you see this emotionalism, you see this excitement, you see people dancing and shouting and really caught up, if you will, in the Spirit. That comes from this African culture. And that's the ecstatic approach to worship. Basically, through repetition and repetition, that then allows people to then move and transcend their condition. We talk about the notion of gospel music being very transformative. Often gospel music especially gets a bad rap because people say it repeats over and over and over and over and over and over again without understanding there was a purpose. When you look at the ecstatic approach to worship, there are two reasons for repetition. One, because the music is a collective art. If you repeat it enough times, the whole community can pick it up and start singing along. But also there's the belief that with repetition, the musical or the emotional affect will change. If I keep singing something over and over again, I'll feel differently the 10th time I sang it than the first time I sang it. I use this example all the time. So say I have to sing a song. Called I Can Do It, right? Now, before I get to sing, I just wrecked my car, just got divorced, found I've got fourth-stage cancer. Anything bad that can happen just happened. But now I got to get up and sing I Can Do It. Needless to say, I don't feel like I can do it, right? So when I start, I can do it. 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 I can, right? Yeah. Now, when I started, I didn't feel like I could do it. But the more I keep repeating that message over and over, after a while, I am being transformed the more I hear that message. That's the way repetition works in gospel. That's why you hear them saying that same vamp 20 times, like, are they finished yet? No, they're not finished. Now, when we talk about the difference in the aesthetics, the European aesthetic is, I hear, I think. The African aesthetic is, I hear, I think, I feel. You don't stop until you feel. Sing till the power of the Lord come down. So that whole idea of the ecstatic approach to worship, that's where the emotionalism comes. That's where the excitement and energy comes in African-American music, and especially in African-American sacred music, because it allows them to get out of their real world and transcend and move into a higher plane where they connect with their God, they touch their God touches them, and they're able to touch one another and now survive another day. All right, good. So when we talk about this, there was still a fear amongst the masters for this singing and this dancing and all this emotionalism. So as a result of that, the masters then prohibited the things that the enslaved Africans did, like their drumming and their dancing and their speaking. We didn't want any of this. No more singing, no more drumming, none of that. And as all of this happened, this deal did not stop the release of the emotion. Blacks still found ways to maintain their African culture, heritage, yet they worshiped in a manner that was acceptable to their slave masters. However, they developed what we call the invisible church. Now, the invisible church was a church that did not have brick and mortar walls, but they would go out into the wilderness, they would go out into the woods, they would find places where they could worship according to their African aesthetic and still express their worship according to that aesthetic approach. And although many of those things that were prohibited, they were not eradicated. So they were told that they could no longer play the drums. So what the Africans did, they took the drums away, but they then put the drumming into their bodies, right? So, for example, let me see. Let's start over here. All right, from you over, just clap for me. Just go. Okay, here. Here and here. Now listen. Good. Where are the drums? Not a single drum in sight. But now they put the drumming in their body, the slapping, the foot, the patting, clapping, the movement, all of those things. Now all of a sudden, the drums were taken away, but they put them into their bodies. Well, the same thing. They said, you can't dance in worship. Now, dance was a major part of worship in African culture, right? However, in the African culture, it's what we called sacred-secular compatibility. There really is no distinction between what was sacred and secular. However, in the European tradition, there was what we call sacred-secular distinction. So dance was considered secular. So when Africans came to America and they began to worship and started all this dancing in worship, it was like, don't do that. That is not for God. That is secular. So because it was a part of their worship, again, it was prohibited, but they found a way to get around it. So they developed what we called the ring shout. The ring shout was something that they defined. They said, well, dancing is if you cross the feet. As long as you don't cross the feet, it's not dancing. So they found some fancy ways to move, but they didn't call it dancing. It was the ring shout. And the way the ring shout would happen is they would form a circle, and they would get the music going. They would shuffle to the beats of drums and tambourine, and they would move around in a counterclockwise motion. Someone would stand in the middle, and they'd get filled with the Spirit until they're, overcome with the Spirit, and somebody else would come in, they'd get filled with the Spirit as well. All right, but the idea is they found a way to put their dance back in worship that was acceptable, if you will. Now, when we talk about the ring shout, I don't know if any of you, many of you, I'm not sure, it's Utah tradition here, but in many churches, black churches, when people would get filled with the Spirit, often people will stand up and form a circle around them. I don't know if anybody's ever seen that before. And as a kid, I thought that was because they were protecting the people to make sure they weren't hurting themselves when they were being filled with the Spirit. But actually, that's reminiscent from the ring shout, which meant that if the Spirit is falling on you, I want to be in close proximity so it will fall on me too. So that's what the ring shout was, so they found a new way to do that. The other thing, they were told not to speak in their languages, their African languages and tongues, right? You have to learn how to speak English. However, it was interesting, and you may notice that African Americans have very unique speech patterns. This goes back to this time in slavery, right? When they were not allowed to be taught to read and write, but they were yet required to speak English. So they had to learn it and pick it up by ear. And consequently, in doing that, they picked up what they heard, and the nouns and the verbs did not agree. They did not have the advantage of formal training. So that's why you'll hear, I be, we be, you be, I ain't going nowhere, I'm finna go. What? You what? Right? Because they did not have the advantage of formal training. So they picked up the language and they found their ways to say what they wanted to say, and they created their own kind of English, they created their own kind of dialects. We now call it Ebonics. But they then took this language and their dialects and put it into their music. So when you start looking at singing some of the spirituals, you'll notice their words like, there and this and Gwen, Gwan and ain't and finnin. Like, what are they talking about? It's the way they spoke their language and they put it in. Also, the fact that in most African countries, they do not have a TH sound. Like this, that, and there. The closest they could get was this, that, there. So that's why African Americans speak in the very unique patterns, and those patterns still exist today. So that's why I'm going to get my hair did instead of I'm going to get my hair done, right? So all of these things are reminiscent of this time, but they put all of this language into their music. They put all of this movement into their music. They put all the rhythm from the drumming into their music. So as you begin to look at this music, those are those common African retentions that were retained, that they put into every musical form and every genre that they developed here while in America. Let's see what's next. That's actually a song. Let's keep moving. Let's see if this will play. This is an example of the ring shout. Let's see if we can get it to play. If so, this is a ring shout called Run, Mary, Run. And you'll notice, oops. It's not going to play? All right, well, you just have to take my word for it. So they stood around in a circle, and they shuffled and they took to the beat, and people would get filled and all of that, and they'd fall up. But you can find this. Go on YouTube and look up Ring Shout, and you can see groups that are still actually performing and keeping that tradition alive, especially those down in the Gullah Islands off the coast of Georgia and South Carolina and Florida. You can still see those traditions happening there as well. All right, let's keep moving. Now, the other thing is they said, stop singing. While the enslaved Africans were in the field, they were singing all the time. And the master said, stop all of that singing in the fields and start working. But when they stopped singing, they did not realize that these were not just songs. They weren't just singing recreational songs. These were actually work songs. And when they stopped singing, the production fell off. They were not as productive, and then they realized, oh, these were songs that helped them to work together, because the songs then were chosen based upon the task, and we call that body-based. The songs were body-based, based upon the task you were doing. You would choose the song, you would choose the tempo based upon the activity, and when you had a tempo to sing with, everybody could work consistently at the same pace. So that's why they began to sing, and then they realized, hey, wait a minute, we'll let you sing, but sing something in English, sing something that we know, and that's when we get the development of the spiritual. We'll talk a little bit more about that historically as it fits into the line, but this is the place from which that whole new musical genre comes. All right? Good. Let's keep on moving. Many of you also know, as you're looking at the chain gangs, often people talk about the tempos and how fast or how slow should they go, but if you can imagine if enslaved Africans were chained together, how fast could you go when you were chained by your neck, by your hands, by your feet? Let me do something very quickly. Everybody stand up really quickly. Stand up, and everybody turn to the left. Now, get close to the people next to you and put your hands on their shoulders, if you can. All right. Now, let me see. What did we do? We learned, let me see. Well, walk together, children. We're going to say, walk together, children, don't you get weary. We're going to take a tempo. Now, you're going to start on your right foot, like this tempo. 1, 2, ready, here we go. And walk together, children, don't. Now, notice your feet are shackled, your hands are shackled, your necks are shackled. Don't you get weary. Walk together, children, don't you get weary. There's great camp meeting in the promised land. Walk, get right. All right, got the idea? Now, go back to your seats. Now, you notice... Now notice, because if you're chained and shackled and your hands and feet and all those things are connected, you're not going to go that fast because you are limited. So the tempos in many of the songs were determined based upon the body. It was determined based upon the limitations of the freedom and the chains and shackles that they endured as well. All right. Oops, point it that way. One of those ways. Let's see. On. There you go. All right. So now what happens is there's a thrust toward conversion. All right. There's a thrust to convert the African slaves to the Christian faith. And this probably was the greatest influence of European culture on the enslaved Africans. Southern Rights reports that Northern whites desired to educate African slaves about the basic tenets of the Christian faith, while Southern white slave owners believed that by converting slaves to the Christian faith, they would be more docile slaves so they could use the Bible to justify it. But the conversion of the African slaves granted them access to the white denominational churches, where they were exposed to the music and worship styles of the Puritans and the Pilgrims. All right, so remember we talked about these cultures colliding. This is how this happened. Through the thrust for conversion, this is how and when these cultures began to collide regarding the sacred music. So, to understand the African American sacred music, you've got to understand the theological philosophy upon which it is based. And although many enslaved African Americans accepted the Christian faith and joined white denominational churches, they developed what we call a faith dialectic, or dual way of looking at the faith. They did not take the words of their masters at face value, but they developed their own way of understanding God. They developed a core theological belief system that helped them to justify the injustices that they faced in the world. And they did not blame God for their suffering, but looked to God to deliver them from their suffering. And in the book Soul Theology, Henry Mitchell and Nicholas Luder Cooper, they suggest that there are 6 core beliefs that African Americans develop, and they are evident in the text of all the African American sacred music that you're going to find. Now let me put a pin in this. We talked about this faith dialectic, them looking at faith in 2 ways. There was a dilemma. Believe it or not, Christianity had come into Africa before Africans came to the New World. right? Because there was the colonization of Africa all the way back to the 1400s. So Christianity was there in a way, but there was a dilemma in Christianity because as Christianity was evolving and spreading and missionaries were going all over the world, there was a sense that everybody who accepted Christianity was to be free. Everybody who was baptized in the Christian faith was to be free, and all of your children were to be free. There were so many things that called for liberation in terms of being a Christian. However, there were lots of rules and codes and things that denied African Americans or enslaved Africans from those same liberties that were supposed to go with the Christian faith. So them understanding, wait a minute, is this the Christianity that really is the faith that we know about, or is this something else we're being told to keep us in subjection? So they looked at it in two different ways. And that's what we mean by faith dialectic. Yes, I know what I'm being told, but I still believe there is a God who intends for me to be free. All right? So that's how we understand what they did. So as a result of that, they believe that there are core beliefs that African Americans developed. The providence of God, that God is in control no matter what. The justice of God, that God is a good God. The omnipotence of God, that God has all power. The omniscience of God, that God knows everything. The goodness of God, that God is good, is a good God in spite of all the evil in the world. And the grace of God, that God is a forgiving God and we have his unmerited mercy and favor. Now, they also had to affirm themselves. They also suggest that there were 4 what we call soul affirmations. They developed affirmations to affirm their humanness and their personhood as children of God. While they would be told they were 3/5 of a person, they were less, they were not equal, they believed and affirmed themselves by saying there was the equality of persons, that we are all equal in the sight of God, the uniqueness of persons, we are all born with special gifts, the family of God, we are all in one human family, red, yellow, black, and white. They are precious in his sight. Jesus loves the little children of the world. And then the perseverance of persons. If you hold out, you will make it through anything. So as we talked about this, we talked about the sense of their language. We talked about now their theological beliefs. We talked about the core affirmations. All of these things are the things they put into their music. This is how you understand the text and the language and the things you'll find in African American sacred music as well. So there was a continual influence of African culture. And while African Americans were exposed to European culture, they always looked back to Africa to create a personal and unique way of expressing themselves. So this merging of the two cultures has constantly created unique African American musical expressions. So sacred music within the European American and African American communities has always developed on a parallel track. While one group created a new style, the other group would adopt and adapt that style. So what you'll find is once these cultures merge, and they were connected musically, they would adopt the musical styles of the other culture and adapt them based upon the cultural aesthetic that was appropriate for their particular setting. So I talk about this concept all the time. I call it adopt and adapt, and you'll find this happening between the development of sacred music as well. So let's explore how this goes throughout music. Well, psalmody. Just as the Africans brought with them music from Africa, the Puritans and Pilgrims brought music from Europe. And they performed this music in work. And the Pilgrims and Pilgrims also brought music to America that influenced the early sacred music created and performed in the black church. They brought psalmody, which was the singing of the psalms of the Bible. And it was performed by having a deacon or presenter to read the psalm text. And the congregation would come in singing texts that were memorized tunes. And at this time, it was believed that only the psalms of the Bible and the scriptures were worthy to be sung in church. So Africans were exposed to this musical form as they were given access to the white denominational churches, and they adopted and adapted them by adding elements of the African performance aesthetic, things like a call and response and flatted notes and pentatonic scales and all these things. And they created a unique way of performing the same European genres, which then transforms them into a unique African American sacred genre. So this is how we come to have several different African American sacred musical styles. So psalmody primarily is metrical singing. Many of you are familiar with this, perhaps. Basically, songs were sung to various tunes. They were poetry. The poetry was written based upon meter, a certain amount of syllables in a certain sentence, if you will. The songs had a certain, like I said, a certain number of syllables per line. The songs used the same number of lines, and they could be exchanged with the tunes and the text. They were interchangeable texts, and tunes allow for variation throughout the worship. And you guys are familiar with this, and maybe didn't know you're familiar with this. Have you ever noticed in your hymn books, you look down at the bottom of your hymns, and you'll see these numbers, like at the bottom. Like 6-3, 11, or 6-6, 6-6, 6-8, 6-8. Let me see. And in the back, you may also have what they call a metrical hymn. So what it is basically the songs are written based upon meter and a certain amount of lines. Well, 6-8, 6-8 is what we call common meter, right? So if I have any song that's in common meter, I can take that same melody or tune and switch it with any text that's also common meter. So for example, if I say Amazing Grace, that's common meter, 6-8, 6-8. Amazing grace, how sweet the sound. There's my 8. All right, 6, that saved a wretch like me. There's my 6. I once was lost, but now I'm found. There's my 8. Was blind, but now I see. All right, so I've got common meter there. Well, let me see another song I can use in common meter is Joy to the World. All right, so what if I go, joy to the world, the Lord has come. Let earth receive her king. Let every heart prepare him room. Let heaven and nature sing. All right, so I could go, joy to the world, the Lord is come. Let earth receive her King. Let every heart prepare him room. Let heaven and nature see. Or I could go, Amazing grace, how sweet the sound that saved a wretch like me. I once was lost, but now I'm found. Was blind, but now I see. Was blind, but now I see. Was blind, but now I see. So the idea is, it was metrical singing. There were memorized tunes, and the specific text was so that people could sing those texts. And the way it was performed, somebody read the actual text because most of the people were illiterate. They couldn't read and write. So someone who could read would read the text, people would hear the text, and then they would sing that text to a memorized tune. That is how psalmody worked. So African Americans then were able to adopt this music. Well, there you go, your metrical hymnal. And you'll see it says CM, which stands for common meter. And you'll see this in the back of your hymnals. And then Black psalmody, we find the same thing as they began to add elements of the African aesthetic, and it became a unique way of performing it that was based upon the African tradition and the African aesthetic as well, and that's Black psalmody. Then what happens is the Protestant Reformation. You're all familiar with the Reformation, right? Well, we've got this wonderful man, Martin Luther. The Reformation basically was a major movement in the Western Christianity in the 16th century that really posed a religious and political challenge to the Catholic Church, and in particular to the papal authority. And it arose basically where there were perceived errors, if you will, abuses and discrepancies by the church. So the Reformation was the start of Protestantism, and the spirit of the Western Church and Protestantism, and what is now the division, if you will, split rather, between the Catholic Church and the Protestant Church, if you will. Well, Martin Luther began by criticizing several things. One, the sale of indulgences, basically saying if you pay, you can have your sins forgiven. Insisting that there was no authority to be able to do this. Talking about purgatory, talking about merit, all these kinds of things. At any rate, they developed a sense of reform based upon the Bible, believing that that each and every one of us, now that Jesus has come, have the liberty and freedom to go to God on ourselves in prayer and not necessarily have a mediator. Well, what comes out of that is what we call the 5 solas. Basically, I think I saw it on somebody's notes or something like that around here the other day, but basically sola scriptura, that's scripture alone. The Bible is our highest authority. Solo fide, faith alone, we are saved through faith alone in Jesus Christ. Sola gratia, grace alone, we are saved by the grace of God alone. Solus Christus, Christ alone, Jesus Christ alone is our Lord, Savior, and King. And then solo Deo gloria, to God be the glory, or to the glory of God alone, and we live for the glory of God. Well, after this Reformation movement comes, that changes the way that people think about singing church music. Because prior to that, only the scriptures and the Psalms of the Bible could be sung. But after the Reformation, now we can talk to God ourselves in our own language, in our own worlds. So, following the Reformation, we can talk to God in that way. And there was the advent of another form of music called line singing, which was performed similarly to psalmody. However, the text now was not just limited to scriptures of the Bible. They were personal texts that people could create. One of the leaders in line singing was a man by the name of Dr. Isaac Watts. Isaac Watts was actually the son of a pastor who he had issues with the music in the church, and he talked to his father. He thought the music was too boring, and his father said, okay, if it's too boring, make some new music. He challenged him to make new music, and he did. And he created this new type of singing, and these songs became very, very popular in Europe, in the church, and they spread from Europe to America, and they were heard by enslaved Africans. And in addition to the new form that he created, he was also disturbed that with line singing and psalmody, you stopped after every line. You notice people recite it, you sing a line. You recite it, they sing a line. You recite it, they sing a line. But you stopped after every line. So he's like, why do we have to stop? Let's keep on moving. And they moved to what they called regular singing without stopping. And of course, believe it or not, there were those who were ready to leave the church because that was the devil's music. Why? You're not stopping. This is awful. So there's always some reason why we're upset, and the music is always somewhere in there messing things up. But at any rate, we have the development of line singing. And this movement spreads over to America, and African Americans hear that. So in 1707, Dr. Watts published a book, Hymn and Spiritual Songs, that became popular in the American colonies, and people began to prefer the line singing over psalmody. And again, in the 1730s, a religious movement swept through the colonies, and they wanted livelier music, better music than the Psalms, and the new songs were then called hymns, and the text utilized religious poems instead of scriptural text. And the songs were popular among whites and blacks and led to a new era into which the Watts hymns reigned very powerfully. So blacks also then loved this music, and it appealed to them because it spoke to the human condition. It talked about trial and salvation. So blacks adopted and adapted line singing by adding elements of the African aesthetic, like flatted notes, pentatonic scales, closed harmonies, and this caused them to be performed in a very unique African-American manner. Now, I don't know if we can play a version of this, but rather than speak the text in an oratorical fashion like the traditional line singing, African Americans would intune the text, right? So the spoken portions would be in tune with the pentatonic scale. So example, if you hear speakers sing, they could go, amazing grace, how sweet the sound to save the wretch like me. It could be, amazing grace, sweet the sound, save the wretch like me. What the love now found now, right? So now all of a sudden, I'm going to intune the text. And they would use more of those specific African-American musical elements to actually then perform line singing. Okay? So we've got line singing, and that goes forth. And Horace Boyer, another ethnomusicologist, makes that distinction and calls that distinction what we call raising a hymn, where they will actually intune the text rather than actually just speaking it in an oratorical fashion that was done traditionally in the European manner. So let's keep moving. Hey, will it play? Let's go back and see. Let's see. Let's see. Play? Will it play? Won't play. All right, well, let's keep on moving. So now we've got psalmody, we've got line singing. Right? Those are two European forms that African Americans adopted and adapted by adding elements of the African aesthetic. Well, it was said that the music performed, the psalmody and line singing, was really not performed very well. That the singing in church was, it was wanting, right? So at any rate, as a result of this, that led to the development of another musical style that African Americans would also begin to do. Let me read a little bit of this. I think it's a little humorous, so you can understand exactly why and how this whole notion of singing moved away from these forms. Let me see if I can find it here so it's a little closer for me to see. But this is how and why we move away. All right, so of all the dismal accompaniments of public worship in the early days of New England, the music was most hopelessly forlorn. Not only from the confused versifications of the Psalms which were used, but from the mournful monotony of the few known tunes and the horrible manner in which these tunes were sung. This is Reverend Thomas Walter, early 18th century writer. He writes, "The tunes are now miserably tortured and twisted and quavered in our churches into a horrid medley of confused and disorderly voices. Our tunes are left to the mercy of every unskilled throat to chop and alter, to twist and change, according to their infinitely diverse and no less odd humors and fancies. I have myself paused twice in one note to take a breath. No two men in the congregation quaver alike or together. It sounds in the ears of a good judge like 500 tunes roared out at the same time, with perpetual interferings with one another. To such chaos had isolation..." Well, anyway, that's enough. But you get the idea. The music, as we were doing the line singing, supposedly there were specific tunes to be sung and there were specific texts to be done. But people would forget the text, and they would forget the tunes. So when they started singing, it was a cacophony of like, oh my God, what is this? Let's just try it. All right, let's say, let me see. Let's say, I've never done this before. I just thought of the idea. Let's try this. Let's see what happens. Let's say you know Amazing Grace is Sweet the Sound and Save the Rest Like Me. You know that text, right? Now, everybody kind of sing in your own part, your own harmony at any time once we give you the cue. Ready? All right. Amazing Grace, how sweet the sound, to save the rest like me. I once was lost, but now I found, was blind, but now I see. Amazing, how sweet the sound, that saved the rest. All right, so you get the idea? So, we're just having some fun here. You still lost. Well, that's the idea. But that was the point. So, most of the people were unskilled in music. So, as they were trying to memorize these tunes and remember the tunes and the text and all of that, it was awful. So as a result of this led to the development of what we call the singing schools. So the concern for bad music in churches led to a system of singing schools. And actually, the singing schools really were the predecessor to music education in schools. Well, at any rate, the schools were created to teach people how to sing and offer better music in church, and they target people with limited exposure, education, and travel, and they were led by people called singing masters. Now, the singing schools, then, they were developed to train people to read music and perform better in church. Now, they developed a system that we called shape notes. A system was developed in order for singers to read music. Each note on the staff was assigned a specific shape. So this enabled singers to identify and recognize notes and sing correct pitches. So they used initially the sol fa la system. So what happens is, whereas people would come in singing any note normally in line singing in psalmody, now they taught them to recognize notes. And they put specific notes with specific shapes and specific syllables, and you learn how to now sing with the sol fa la symbol, so that rather than everybody singing everything all over the place, they sang specific notes with specific harmony, and now that was much better, right? Amen, hallelujah. Well, the schools, again, were led by trained musicians who taught people to read based upon the sol fa la system. And through this system, church singers began to sing in precise harmony and bring more order to church music. And in shape note singing tradition, the singers would start by giving the note. Somebody would give the note, they would tune, and everybody would tune together, and then they would all sing. So what they would do is they would sing through the hymn with the shape notes first to get the notes, and then they would go back and sing the text. So they created a book that was very famous for shape note singing called The Sacred Harp, one of the most famous books, and it was based upon that four-note solfege symbol, but eventually the four-note system was expanded to the seven-note system that many of you are familiar with, do, re, mi, fa, sol, la, ti, do. You've heard that as well. Well, there were African Americans who also led in the development of shape note singing. One was a gentleman by the name of Newport Garner, and he was born as a slave as well, but he eventually bought his freedom. He won the lottery. He was trained in music and Christianity, became a composer, teacher, and preacher. He actually was one of the first to use the seven shape note system. He studied with Andrew Law, and he developed that system, and he trained and taught African Americans and white Americans this system, and the practices are still used in many areas, especially in the South, southern Alabama, lots of places, they still have singing circles. Do you all have any shape note circles in Utah? Anybody familiar with that? All right, well, anyway, people are still doing this, but again, African Americans adopted shape note singing, and they expanded it using the seven shape note singing and some of the flatted notes and things like that, but they then developed a book later on in the 30s called The Colored Sacred Harp. That included then some spirituals and particular hymns that were popular with the African American church. So again, you see, same musical forms developing in both communities, European and African American community. Psalmody, line singing, shape note singing. Well, I don't think we can play it, but this was an example of a shape note song, and we were going to let you hear that, but let's go on. You can find it on YouTube somewhere. And actually, I think you guys had a chance to hear, some of you saw the documentary that we did called Amen Music of the Black Church. The choir did an example of a shape note song. So we can let you know about that as well, and you can find that as well. Well, the issue is, okay, African Americans are actually being a part of the white denominational churches, but that did not provide a safeguard from discrimination and racism in the church. And many African Americans were upset by the fact that they were considered brothers and sisters in the faith, yet they were mistreated even in the church. And certain things, as African Americans were then given permission to then become ministers and pastors, they began to recruit many African Americans to join many churches, and at some point the population of African Americans often outnumbered those of the European Americans, and they therefore began to develop galleries or special places for African Americans to sit that were not in the main sanctuary. They would be up in lofts or behind the church or outside the church. The other thing that was challenging is African Americans were not even allowed to pray at the altar, right? So as a result of this, many blacks began to leave the white denominational churches to form their own denominational churches. One of the people who left, Richard Allen, I don't know if as United Methodist people, you know that name, Richard Allen. Well, Richard Allen was an example. He was born in 1760, and actually he was licensed to preach as a part of the Methodist Episcopal Church, and he was appointed at St. George Methodist Episcopal Church in Philadelphia, and he was really, really powerful. He developed an early service for African Americans that really grew. They began to raise money and work toward a building project, and it was really, really wonderful. But another one of his friends, colleagues, Absalom Jones, was also licensed to preach, and there was an incident during one service where Absalom Jones went to the altar to pray, and they accosted him, and they were picking him up and moving him out and trying to take him out of church in the middle of the prayer. And the African Americans thought that was just so wrong and insensitive that after the prayer, they all kind of left, exited, and they began to develop their own denominational churches. Well, Absalom Jones actually left, and the group that left with them, they decided, we want to build our own church. So they decided, they found a place, and they began to create money to build their own church, but they voted that they still wanted to stay connected to the Church of England. So they then established the Episcopal Church. Richard Allen was like, now that we are leaving the church, why still stay connected to the church that is still discriminating? So he then established the first black denomination, which was the African Methodist Episcopal Church, and he established that church. So Richard Allen began to develop this new church, and one of the first things that he did was to develop a hymnal for the church. And this hymnal was a collection of hymns and spiritual songs from various authors by Richard Allen. So what he did was he decided to make a collection of all the hymns that were very popular for the African Americans in worship. And he compiled them into one book. Now, if you look at the titles in the book, you'll notice that most of the hymns were not written by African Americans. They were hymns written by Isaac Watts and the Wesleys and Newton and other people, but they were songs that spoke to the human condition, and African Americans really embraced those particular hymns. So he wrote that hymn book, and that was the first book that happened for African Americans. Now, it was not a book with musical notes. It was just basically a book with text. Also, you find at this point, the black Episcopalians were the first to introduce trained choirs into their worship. They sang anthems accompanied by organs and harps and harmoniums. And these instruments came in again because people did not sing in tune. So this was one way to bring in instruments to help people stay on tune. But choirs were not always welcome in church because they replaced congregational singing. So if you can imagine that all the singing in church was everybody in church, but now you got these special people up in the choir who are singing, and they're so good and they're better than everybody else, and now they're singing and we just have to sit and listen to them. So people didn't like the choirs, and there were people who actually left the churches and started their own churches because they didn't like choirs singing. So this began splits within the black church as well regarding formal or informal music performance, trained and untrained performance, choir versus congregation, and they would have what they called sacred serenades, which were classical concert music, as opposed to the ring shout, which is a real emotional kind of shout. And so you'll find that all this was beginning to happen in the church, so all this was changing the way that the music was happening. So now we got psalmody, line singing, shape note singing, and we're moving out and we're starting to have the hymns come into the church. Well, another thing that happened, there were several great awakenings. There was one in the end of the 1700s, there was one around 1800s, another around 1840s and 50s. Well, at any rate, because of these awakenings, there was no longer desire to have that staid kind of line singing. They wanted something a little more exciting. And there was a advent of the camp meetings that would happen in America, and people would gather literally in a main tent, and there would be a preacher who would preach, and blacks and whites would gather together. And because of segregation and rules, blacks would be on one side, whites would be on the other, but they still sang the same music. They still heard the same messages. And it was said that when the African Americans would sing, they would sing very fervently because singing was a part of their worship experience. And when the service was over, they would continue to sing. They would sing until 12, 1, 2, 3 in the morning, continue singing and dancing all throughout the camp meeting, and they continued to sing. And as a result of the singing, they started composing some of their own songs. They started taking hymns and verses from one song and putting them in another song and adding all these things together. And some suggest that this was the beginning of how they began creating spirituals. They began creating their own verses and psalms. So as we talk about camp meetings, they literally were out in the woods, in the wilderness, and it was exciting preaching, it was exciting praying all around the campfires. And it was said that even at the end of the camp meeting, African Americans would do the ring shout, and they would march around the whole church and or the whole camp area. And there was that excitement and energy. But they heard this music, they heard these hymns, they adapted them, and began transforming them into something that was totally new. So some people then began to establish churches at this point. Others began to have their own camp meeting services, and this music was a part of this. Well, for those who were generally in the South, they were finally given permission as African Americans to gather as groups, and they would develop what they called praise houses. In these praise houses, these were places where they would actually meet. They could worship according to the African aesthetic. They could do the ring shout. They could dance. They could sing till the power of the Lord came down. But these were specific places where they could actually worship according to the African aesthetic in a free way. So people often ask, well, why is the black church so important? And it's so important because these praise houses, actually, they led to the development of the churches that we know, but the church was the one institution where blacks were free to emote. The church allowed people to release, relate, and rejoice, right? So as they go through their experience during the week, the trials that are pent up, whatever, the emotionalism can come through the release of their music. Then they also relate horizontally with one another, but vertically with their God. And then as they are transcended and they worship and connect with God, they are able then to rejoice and praise their God. And then the other thing, because the black church, there was the process, when you go into worship, the process of worship leads to a product. And the product of worship is transformation and action. So again, going through this process, singing this music, praying those prayers, hearing those sermons, allowed African Americans to be transformed in the process so they could continue to endure. So consequently, we must see worship as functional. Music and worship served a purpose. Everything was done for a very specific reason. So again, that goes back to this whole notion of the emotionalism in worship and why it was significant. We talked about the whole idea of emotionalism and the ecstatic approach and why the black church and the music is so emotional. We talked about that, but also what connects to the emotionalism is the sense of freedom. The church is a place where they are free to emote. So if you can imagine coming from Africa where you were free and you had all things, then being placed on ships, then being placed on plantations. So it's imagine if I said to you, you have all of Utah, roam freely. And I said, well, you only have Hilltop United Methodist Church. That's all you get. I said, nope, all you get is that little corner back there. Let me close the door. That's all you get. Well, if that's the plantation, that's the corner, what do you do when you get out of that little corner? Right? You release. And that's what has happened for many African Americans in worship. So there's a sense that there is a binding, if you will, into a small place, and the church provides a space of release. So that's what you'll find in the church and in the music as well. So we talked about camp meetings, moving on. We talked about that thrust of moving on so we can keep on moving. So we get to the spiritual. So we talked about how the spiritual begins to develop. We talked a little bit about that earlier, how these musical forms began to emerge because as they were working in the fields, they were told to stop singing and they realized they were important. So as the spiritual comes, we'll find that as the Great Awakening becomes further, that the masters would send preachers, itinerant preachers, to the various plantations to speak about the Bible, to teach about the Word, and African Americans then heard the stories of the Bible. So the stories of the Bible were also things they began to include into their songs. So now when we talk about the spiritual, you'll hear the term Negro spiritual. You'll hear that often, and people often say, why is it called the Negro spiritual? Well, at this particular point, especially after emancipation, Negro was a term that African Americans used or referred to themselves at that particular time in history, and that was the time when the concert spiritual became prominent. That was the term that they used. That's why it's called the Negro spiritual. However, you'll find other names like Negro, colored, Afro-American, Black, African American, of African descent. The same group, but pending the time in history, there was a different name that African Americans used to refer to themselves or they were referred to. So it's the same group, but that's why that name was referred to the spirituals, all right? So, but other than that, through sensitivity, we know we kind of take the name that people refer at a particular point in history, and we will do that, but that is why you hear that name and you hear them called the Negro spirituals as well. So these songs were used for many reasons. They were actually religious folk songs used to praise their God. They were also work songs, but they were also songs that allowed them to communicate. They were songs of faith that allowed them to speak to one another. They were songs of survival. They were songs that allowed them to actually speak back, if you will, to the oppressor and tell their stories. So people ask from where did they get the music? The music often comes from Africa. If you look at most of the original spirituals, most all of them are based upon the pentatonic scale. And you'll find that all of them have that original melody. You can go right back to the pentatonic scale and find the spirituals there. Other things they brought from Africa you'll find is call and response, the pentatonic scales, a steady pulse, the drums, and the rhythmic syncopation as well. Then people often ask from where does the text come for the spirituals? Well, the texts primarily come from three different places. They come from the Old Testament. Of course, the slaves related to the Israelites who were in the Bible, who were also the enslaved people for whom they believed God fought. So they used the stories of the Old Testament. Moses, delivered the Israelites. Joshua led the people. Joshua fought the battle of Jericho. Elijah was translated, into heaven on a chariot. Daniel, the Lord delivered him from the lion's den. David, was God's, the apple of God's eye. Little David played on your heart. So the Old Testament stories. But then there's also the New Testament stories. The apostles and disciples, right? And, they preached about being obedient. Paul preached. There was Peter, there was John, there was Mary, there was Martha. But of course, in the New Testament, there was Jesus. He was the deliverer that came to set the captives free. So they sang and expected that God would deliver them through Jesus. But then there's also a third level of text, which we call personal meaning text. And these texts were texts that allowed them to speak of their own personal belief and affirm their humanness. Swing low, sweet chariot, coming for to carry me home. Oh freedom over me. When you start finding the personal pronouns in spirituals, those were the songs of personal meaning as well. Now, then, to understand the spirituals, people understand, how do you have to understand them? Well, you can understand them literally, meaning they were praise songs. So you can literally, understand them as the literal Bible stories, and they were using them perhaps to teach. They were just singing about their faith. But also, the spiritual supply we call mask and symbol. Mask and symbol basically was a way where understanding that the slaves could not always express openly what they felt without retribution. So they masked the meaning in symbolism that they understood, but people outside of the community might not also understood. So the meanings were masked, and that's how you understand the spiritual, either literally or through some kind of symbolic way as well. All right, then people ask then, how and why is it that they sang, through this oppression? Well, the African slaves or enslaved Africans believed that if you can keep a song in your heart, you can make it through any trial. So they sang through everything. No matter what, they continued to sing. But they also realized that though man could take everything away, they could not take the songs in your heart. So they continued to sing. Now, we talked about this idea. Let me see. I'm rushing. I'm going around. We're almost there. We're almost close. Our time is there, but I'm almost close. Let me see. We're good. Let's keep on moving. So here's the quick thing. Are you ready? All right, we're already on warp speed. I'm going like Star Trek, go beyond where nobody's gone. All right. So how do you get from the spiritual to gospel? How do you get all the way to gospel? You got to go through hymnody. So what happens is, all right, after the Civil War ended, after Emancipation Proclamation, the country was divided, right? So there were ministers and evangelists who decided they wanted to heal the war-torn country. So at this point, there were white ministers who combined with musicians who wrote these special songs, and they worked all over developing revivals and working to convert people, and there were special songs that were written for their sermons, right? And they were initially called gospel songs, but we now call them hymns. So we do know, as a result of that, after Reconstruction, we know that there were Jim Crow laws and things that caused for the separation of blacks and whites again, and as a result, African Americans could not go to these revivals. So they developed what they called colored nights for these same revivals, where they still preached and they still formed choirs to learn these new gospel songs, where there were people like Charles Tinley and William Sherwood and Thomas Dorsey who went to these revivals. They heard these songs that we now call hymns. They adopted them and adapted them by adding special African American or African components to them, and they developed black hymnody. So we get black hymnody that comes forth. And so some of those early hymn writers, people like Lucy Campbell, Charles Tinley, Charles Mason, Garfield Haywood, Charles Bryce Jones, they were all African Americans who began to develop hymnody and writing in the hymn style. So now we got psalmody, line singing, shape note singing, spirituals, hymnody, all right? Then, as we go through hymnody, we know the same ideas. They continue to develop by changing and transforming the language to reflect the African American experience, and the music to respect those African pieces as well. We're not listening to pieces. We're moving on. 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 So I want to show you how we get here. Then, the spiritual evolves. The spiritual that we know evolves in 5 different directions, right? There are many who say no new spirituals were written after 1863, after Emancipation Proclamation. However, that spiritual does evolve. There are some who suggest that the spiritual is the first original American music to develop in this nation, but we'll talk about that, and it evolves several ways. A secular direction where it turns into the blues, jazz, ragtime, rock and roll, rock. All of that happens there. Then it evolves a theatrical direction. It goes into what's called minstrelsy. Minstrelsy was a practice where white performers would paint their face in blackface and imitate the slaves. Was not necessarily a great, fun, wonderful thing to do. However, the irony of minstrelsy is that there was a period when African Americans were not allowed to do their own music. But those who did the minstrelsy kept their music alive, right? Then minstrelsy turns into vaudeville. Vaudeville turns into musical theater, all right? Then it evolves artistic direction. It goes into the art song spiritual, where the spiritual is then used and combined with classical music performed in the bel canto style for solo voice and the concert stage. And we have that distinction. We have people like Elizabeth Greenfield, loads and loads of wonderful African-American divas of the late 1800s who performed classical music, but the spiritual, the art song spiritual for the concert stage comes forth, and you still hear that going as well. Then it evolves in an academic direction. After Emancipation Proclamation, there was a move to allow African-Americans to be moved into American society. At that point, the historical black colleges and universities were established. Many of them were in need of funding and money. One, indeed, was Fisk University. By the way, just this week, just Sunday, the current director of the Fisk Jubilee Singers, Paul Kwame, just passed. I'm not sure if any of you know his name. We were sorry to lose him. But at any rate, so Fisk in need of money. The treasurer had an idea. Let's take a group out on the road and sing concert tours and make some money. So they got 8 singers and accompanists, some chaperones, went out and began singing traditional classical music on the road. They didn't make as much money. They didn't fare as well. So, one day they're sitting around, people say, why don't you sing the spirituals and the old music, your people used to sing? They're like, nobody wants to hear that music. Nobody wants to hear the spirituals and that music from the days of slavery, whatever. At any rate, the story goes, they were at a convention in Oberlin, Ohio, and they were singing their traditional classical repertoire, and people were just kind of singing and talking. But then the director gave the cue, and they started singing the spirituals, and the room got quiet. And the people were so moved by the singing of the spirituals that they raised more than $20,000 on that tour, and that was in 1871. Now, I'll take $20,000 today. Sign me up, right? So what they've realized is somebody does want to hear this music. So they went back and took the oral field spiritual, combined it with European choral harmonies. Here we go, ABC, right? And developed what we call the concert spiritual. So for all of you who sang spirituals in high school and college with the sheet music, that's the concert spiritual that comes out of the line of Jubilee Singers. As a result of their work, they raised more than $150,000 over 7 years, built Jubilee Hall, Still stands on the campus of Fisk University. It's a wonderful museum. Go and see it if you ever get to Nashville. Any rate, everybody began to imitate them. All the other HBCUs began to put choirs together, just traveled and made money and all of that. They no longer felt original, so they went back to the drawing board and said, well, let's do something different. They started a male quartet. The quartet also became very popular, that people all over the country started singing and developing male quartets, right? So, the barbershop folks had quartets, right? The Porters Union, the cement layers, everybody had quartets. And when you think of even barbershop quartet music, you don't generally think African American, but it comes right at the line of the spirituals. We now can actually hear what these quartets sound like from the 1800s. There was a company called Document Records that's bought all the early cylinders and recordings and now have converted them all to CDs. You can hear them, and I normally have examples of them, but that's all right. You can take my word for it. You'll hear it and go, oh my God, there it is. But it started in the 1860s with these African Americans at Fisk University as well. All right, then, after Emancipation Proclamation, we're almost there. There were two trends of thought in the African American community. One group said, now that we are free, we should go back and worship like we did in Africa. There are no limitations. We can do what we want to do in the African way. The other group said, now that we are free, we must demonstrate that we're equal to our white counterparts and must do everything according to the European aesthetic. So that creates a kind of division in the African American community, and that also affects African American sacred music. So we end up then with three different types of churches after Emancipation Proclamation. Again, thinking about our aesthetic continuum, right? Africa, Europe, and something in the middle. So we have those with little economic means, low class, moderate economic means, middle class, high economic means, right? Then we have those with little no education, moderately educated, highly educated. Then we have those with lots of emotion, little emotion, no emotion, right? So when you think of the black church, generally people just kind of think of the black church you see on the stereotypical views on the movies where they're shouting and screaming and swinging from the chandeliers, doing flips. But that's not the black church. It's the entire continuum. So there are black churches that are different places, and it just so happened that because of the social economic status, the educational status, all those things, the emotional levels, then happened to look like they were divided into three different areas. And consequently, the music of the black church was representative of those levels of emotion and education and wealth as well. So we know that the music continued to evolve, and then what happened is as the plantations began to close in the South, and there was a sense of wooing everybody to come to the North, African Americans left. About 6 million African Americans left the South and went to the North and migrated to get the different factory jobs and the things in the North. And as a result, African Americans moved out all over the country. Even some went to the West. Some came to Utah. How about that, right? So they moved all the way over the country, and African Americans left the South, and we'll find that they took their religious music and practices with them. So when they get to the North, we'll find that several things happened. You'll find that there was classism, there was colorism, because people were then trying to determine, am I going to go toward the African aesthetic or the European aesthetic or somewhere in the middle? But the churches then sang music that was relevant to the various aesthetics. So you found black church singing anthems, the Mozart anthems and the Brahms and all of these things, as well as those that were very, very powerful and very, very emotional as well. So you found in 1906, you have what's called the Azusa movement. The Azusa movement was a movement led by an African-American preacher by the name of William Seymour. So the spiritual evolves in this sacred direction. And this movement, this preacher believed that that God could manifest himself as he did in the first century church with singing and speaking in tongues and being healed and miracles and so forth. Well, anyway, this movement goes forth, and as a result of this powerful movement, people came from all over the world to experience this movement because literally they were speaking in tongues. They were being filled with the Spirit. There was healing. And William Seymour was the person who was responsible for starting the development of this movement. And as a result, because it was so exciting, they needed exciting music to go along with it. So again, they turned to the spiritual. And as they turned to the spiritual, they developed what we call the congregational spiritual. Many of you guys are familiar with what that is. The congregational spiritual, songs like, "This little light of mine, I'm gonna let it shine," right? "Glory, glory, hallelujah, Congregational spirituals, right? Those spirituals that were now bringing the whole congregation back into worship. So you'll find in those Pentecostal churches, they moved back toward dancing and holy dancing and shouting and speaking in tongues and this emotional type of music. So you had this on one side, you had the more intellectual, academic, Western style music on the other side, and you had a little bit of a mixture in the middle. So you got this vast sense of the kind of music that's happening. Well, those who were on the European aesthetic side were very well educated. Many of them had money and resources and could build their own churches from the ground up in the 1860s, right? So there are many black churches that build major edifices because they had money and they could afford to hire musicians who were formally trained. But there were folks who were former rural slaves who didn't have those resources and were now in the city. And they couldn't afford to hire those formerly trained musicians and actually didn't want that music anyway. They wanted music that was more like the music of Africa. So guess who ended up playing in their churches? They developed what we call storefront churches. I'll go back to there. They would find abandoned buildings, churches, any place they could to be able to start a church. And now in urban areas, you'll still see storefront churches. They look like a 7-Eleven, look like a bank, or look like a gas station, but now it's a church, right? So they would have church in there, and again, they could not afford to hire formally trained musicians, so they would take anybody who would come in and play, right? So guess who came in and played? Well, these folks who came in and played, you're not going to listen, going to keep on moving, keep on moving, keep on moving. The folks that actually came in and played in their churches were people who played blues and jazz all during the week. So they're playing blues and jazz in the clubs all during the week, right? But when Sunday comes, they go to the church and play in these churches, but they don't leave their blues and jazz at the door. They bring it in and start combining it with the hymns and spirituals of the church, and they form gospel music. So in these Pentecostal churches, primarily, 5 musical forms merge: congregational spirituals, white hymnody, black hymnody, quartet music, and blues and jazz, and they form gospel music, and that's how we get the gospel music. So in the development of the spiritual, through the congregational spiritual, it moves into gospel music, and Thomas Dorsey is considered the father of gospel music. He was the early composer of gospel music in the late 1920s and 30s. He established the first church gospel choir. He established the first gospel convention. He established the first gospel publishing company. He established and developed what we call the gospel highway, a network of places where gospel singers could perform. He developed what we call the gospel blues, a musical form. He composed the famous hymn, Precious Lord, Take My Hand. Many of you may have heard of that. And he also even was the one who even coined the term gospel music. So Thomas Dorsey brings us in. We have gospel music here, and gospel music was not initially accepted because it was too bluesy and jazzy. It was all these blues and jazz rhythms and all of that. People didn't like it, so they were thrown out of a lot of traditional churches. But eventually, it gained acceptance around 1945 because some other younger artists came and added more traditional elements, watered it down, and made it acceptable, and that leads off to what we call the golden age of gospel, 1945 to 1965, and that's when gospel becomes an art form, and all these major pioneers began to find a place for singing and traveling all over the world to do this music. Now, these initial people, I'm going to go, here we go. We got 30 seconds. I'm going through. Gospel music you find. We have the golden age of gospel, and we have our first superstars in gospel music. We have Rosetta Tharpe, who performed at Carnegie Hall in 1938 and 39. She was the first female to accompany herself on guitar. We have Mahalia Jackson, who was the first million-seller record in 1947. Move one up a little higher. She was the first to have a European tour in 52. First television show. Clara Ward Singers, they were first to travel overseas. They performed at the Newport festivals. I mean, they were really great. So all this happened. That's James Cleveland down at the bottom. Well, what happens is we've got a whole era. We've got all of these folks that are singing. But gospel music from that period is not the same as it is today. And it's evolved since the 1930s. How and why is this? There was a historical pattern, and it's this. Someone comes to the church with a style that's considered too secular. Church doesn't like it. They refuse it. But the secular world embraces it, and they make a lot of money. Did I say a lot of money? A lot of money. So somebody in the church takes that new style, combines it with traditional elements, and they tweak it until the church says they like it. They like it, they take it to a peak, and then bam, somebody comes in and does that same principle. That pattern has happened 5 times in the history of gospel music already. So since they started, gospel up to today, we have several different eras. So you'll find, as a result, there is a constant sacred-secular relationship where people keep bringing in secular music to the church. They keep then going out, then they keep bringing it back, then they keep going out, they keep bringing it back. So the first set of people who defected in the 1950s were people like Sam Cooke, Aretha Franklin, Ray Charles. They were gospel singers. And then the secular world realized that people could make money by selling this music, so they said, what if we get these folks to come out and sing secular music, sing the same music style, just change the words? So they did. So the traditional gospel folks left the church, they changed the words, and they called it soul music. That's how we get soul music. So folks evolve, they come back in the church, we get a contemporary style. That's where Andre Crouch and Edwin Hawkins, those folks come in. That's Oh Happy Day, right? Those folks, they leave, we go out, and eventually we get an R&B style. But during that same era, we have what we call the classical era. We have what I call the total school, where people begin to study classical music and incorporate that in gospel music. I'm kind of in that era in that school, and those are many of my friends and mentors, people like Richard Smallwood and Robert Price and Henry David and Utterbach and all of those folks. They were in that area, and that's where gospel comes forth. But then it goes outside the church, and we get R&B. Right? We got James Brown and Gladys Knight and Luther Vandross and all those folks. Well, it comes back in again. And I'm going the wrong way. Da-da-da-da. And then we call the word ministry era. It's totally redefined in the 80s as just the gospel message set to music, any musical style, and the performance practices. And now we got all this versatility in gospel music that's in the 80s. We got contemporary blues and jazz coming in. We've got music that's focused on the word, and that's where the praise and worship music in school starts happening in the 80s. That comes forth. People like, Thomas Whitfield, Take Six, Andre Crouch, Vanessa Bell, the Winans, Saints in Praise, Patrick Henderson, Daryl Coley, those guys, that's all during that movement as well. Then we go back out. We get certain things, rap and hip-hop happening. Then it comes back in the church, and we get an urban era with rap and hip-hop. John Key, Hezekiah Walker, B.B. and C.C. Winans, Yolanda Adams, Kirk Franklin, never heard of him, Fred Hammond, Mary, Tone. That's the rap and hip-hop coming back in the church. Then they go back out, and we get things happening there. We get all this new stuff going, and then they come back in, and we're now living in what we call a crossover era, where we have contemporary Christian music now being led and performed by most of the praise and worship teams in black churches. And now we have what we call concert gospel music. Gospel is now in the academic environment, and then we have global gospel. That gospel has now been globalized, and it's all over the world. So I've kind of come a long way in a long time, and I think that's where I'm going to stop right there. But the idea is there's a whole lot. What we did a documentary called Amen, Music of the Black Church. It was picked up by American Public Television. They're going to play it for the next 4 years, literally. And we were blessed. We won an Emmy Award for this project. And it is available. So you can actually go online and watch it 24 hours a day, anywhere. So we can give you that link. You can look at that. But it does the history, and you can hear the songs and the examples of all the things we talked about today. So you can go forth and look and hear that. I know we're over, but that's all right. Really quickly, any questions, any thoughts? I know it's like overwhelming, like, oh my God, it gives us a ton of stuff. But I want to give you as much as possible, but hopefully you see from Africa all the way up to the present, and how no matter what styles the African Americans adopted, they always adapted it by adding elements of the African aesthetic, but all of the music was always their response to the oppression or discriminations or challenges they faced. And in the church, they were able to release this music in a way that would enable them to be transformed and endure the struggles they faced. Yes, sir? None of this, because those books are voice books. All of it, however, is in a new book I'm writing called What Happened to Gospel Music, and all of it is in my dissertation. My doctoral dissertation is it's called Defining African American Gospel Music by Tracing its historical and musical development from 1900 to 2000. So I start with pre-gospel music and come all the way decade by decade up to 2000. So that's available immediately. The book I'm not finishing, I'm writing it, but the book has all of this and a whole lot more detail in all those areas. Yes, ma'am. Yes, well, absolutely. Absolutely, in a sense, yes and no. There is, when you talk about the scripture in Colossians 16, which says that we admonish you to always sing in spiritual songs and hymns and da-da-da. Spiritual songs are basically those songs that were inspired by the Holy Spirit in that time. There were some who said, well, they are actually, the spirituals are also spiritual songs. in that they were songs that were inspired based upon improvisation in those moments. However, we do know people look at that as the title of how spirituals got their name, but also we know that when they were Germans who visited the country, who remarked on the music of the enslaved Africans and how spiritual it was, and how spirited it was, and they called spiritual was the word they used, and that name also kind of stuck. So there are many theories of how the name came, but one of which, when we talked about the music in camp meeting, they sang spiritual songs, which were songs that were improvised based upon the moving of the Spirit, and they were created by the people in that moment, inspired by God. So yes, I do talk about that. Yes?
In the packet or in the bag that we got, there's this great summary of everything.
Yes, everything I talked about is in that packet.
So, those of you who couldn't write that.
Yes, yes, yes. Everything that we talked about is in there. Everything is in that handout. Any other questions? Yes, ma'am. Yeah, that's a good question. Yes, yes, absolutely. That's a good question. Actually, that's the basis of where I start my book. I started in 2000 when Kurt Franklin released his piece, Stomp. Everybody said, this is not gospel, this is awful. So we started asking the question, well, what is gospel? And you go back to the beginning, well, they all had that same issue. They said Thomas Dorsey's music wasn't gospel. They said Abraham Hawkins' music wasn't gospel, but now they're in the hymn book. But here's the piece. The greater issue to answer that question goes back to what I talked about before, sacred-secular compatibility or sacred-secular distinction. In the African tradition, there was really no distinction between what was sacred and secular. So there was not a problem for Africans to sing and to dance and to worship because the same affection of love would be the same for my God as it would be for my brother. So I could sing, and change the pronouns from you. For example, the BB and CC one, I'm lost without you. Well, do they mean you, God? Or do they mean you? I'm talking about my honey, my love, or whatever, right? So the idea is, and there is no distinction in the African tradition, but there was one in the European tradition. So as African Americans came and were a part of that tradition, they adopted that view that there was a distinction between sacred and secular. So consequently, African Americans who moved back and forth were demonized because there was a sense that this is for God and this is for man, when in actuality, in the African tradition, there would be no distinction. So we put up those kinds of walls because we've accepted those distinctions based upon the different aesthetics, but they would not be. Now, when we talk about literally, we still kind of do that demonization. However, it's not as great as it was. Specifically, Sam Cooke and Aretha Franklin and all those folks who left, the defectors, they were really, really demonized because they were strong, powerful gospel artists. And then to go sing secular, it was like, oh my God, you left the church. But that same pattern has happened with every generation. So what my book is talking about in terms of the evolution of gospel, this is a pattern that happens all the time. So rather than fight about the fact that the music is secular or people are singing whatever, we now understand, oh, that's just people trying to bring the music of the day into the church to be relevant to the people of the day. And once we understand that, we don't have to fight about that anymore. Right? So now we can say, is the music effective? Is it fruitful in what they're doing, as opposed to, is it a style that we think is appropriate or inappropriate? But absolutely. But yes, but that really goes back to that whole African concept of sacred-secular compatibility, where there's no distinction, as opposed to the European, where there is a distinction, and as African Americans get into that place, then they struggle trying to find a place where it fits. But we call those songs transformations, where you take a song and change the pronouns, and all of a sudden, it's gospel. All of a sudden, it's sacred. Sam Cooke's, what's the song? You send me, darling, you do. Well, before it was darling, it was Father. Stand By Me, Darling. That was first Stand By Me, Father. He had all these songs that he recorded that weren't hits in the gospel, so he took them to the secular part, changed the words, and then they were big hits. So the idea is that happens all the time, and it's happened historically from the beginning all the way through to the present. So once we understand the historical piece, then we go, oh, this is just a part of that pattern, and in the African tradition, there is no issue with that, or there is no conflict, as it's been made to me be in other ways. Yes? Yes, sir? Well, immediately right now, we're in the midst of a transition that we're calling, I'm calling it crossover gospel, where now as gospel is moving outside of the church and moving in different areas, and forms are coming in that are being more impactful in the black church that are not African-American based, it's crossing over. For example, most praise and worship teams now, if you go to churches, they're singing CCM music, contemporary Christian music, right? Now, some of them may add a little, black, feeling to it with the music or something, but it's CCM music, right? But that also created a fight within the church. That music is not black, right? But again, whenever the fight and argument happens, it's a clue that a new era is happening in gospel music. So that's the point. So believe it or not, in the next 5, 6, 10 years, there will be some other new musical style that the young people will come up with that the old people think is awful, right? For example, I remember when Oh Happy Day came out. I was a teenager. We loved Oh Happy Day. But the old people, don't play that song in the church. They were playing it on the secular station. That's the devil music. I'm like, this ain't the devil music. This is good. This is, right? But now it's in the hymn book, right? Thomas Dorsey's songs are in the hymn book, right? They were thrown out of churches. So we know that as we see this pattern, we don't have to be anxious about it. It doesn't mean you don't have a personal preference. Now, so I don't particularly like that, but I do understand it's just a part of the evolution. Then you can release that and then worry about, is it being effective to do what it's supposed to do? Is it really winning people, or is it just some noise? Then the argument is different rather than it's too secular, because we know that pattern happens all the time. Yes, yes, sir. Well, that's all of it. Well, that goes back to this issue. You can't get away from it. There's a word that's out today. People talk about appropriation. You ever heard that term? About the appropriation of black culture, da-da-da-da. Now, there is a sense, it is true. There is a sense that African Americans create specific things. And when they are seen to be valuable and worthy of creating and generating income, they are then appropriated in many ways where people outside of the community and culture are able to use them to make money and to create wealth, and don't necessarily give that wealth back to the community from which it comes. That's actually true. But the issue is, because of the proximity of these cultures, it is impossible to say that you're not going to pick up stuff from the other culture, because this is what happened. And it created something new. So there's always this place where things are together. Now, there was a sense that there's a scholar named Ali Wilson. He wrote an article called Appropriation Revitalization Theory. It is true that African Americans are creating these things as a response to their oppression. And then when people see that they take them and become a part of them, again, because of the connection, he says that African Americans then create something new. They revitalize, they create something new, because now what we did was taken. Well, that's not ours any longer, so let's create something new. And then when that's taken, well, we'll create something new. When that's taken, we'll create something new. So the idea is, it's very difficult to get away from the connecting of these cultures. But depending on where you stand, where you live, the environment in which you're in, sometimes they're like this. And there really is no way to distinguish them. And that's what Dr. Simmons is talking about when he's trying to say see. It's not that, and it's not that, but, it's this, right? And that's what I was talking about, that place of not really fitting. It's like, okay, well, but that's hopefully where we could come, where it's not yours or mine, but it's ours. So, that is happening in some places musically, but wouldn't that be neat if the world came to a place where we could love each other and get along and it be ours? So we still have some work, and maybe we can lead that fight from the church, from the music, and make a difference to bring people together that might not ordinarily come together by bringing those things together. But you're absolutely right. That's how it's coming. And you can't say it's one or the other, because it's all of it. It's all together. Yes. I know we're way over time, but we're on the way. All right, so what I'm going to do is think of your questions. We got some lunchtime. We got some afternoon time. I'm here. We'll talk after if necessary. But I definitely want to make sure you get some of the information. And all your questions, I'm open to answer anything that we can. But what we're going to do right now, it's 10 of 11. What we're going to do is we're going to take a little break, give you about 10 minutes to get rest, get some water, do whatever, and then get in the stand. By noon, we're going to start. We've got about 3 more songs, a couple more songs we want to learn. We'll get those things started today. Get those this morning, get those out of the way. And then we'll have lunch. And then we'll come back, we'll start polishing, refining, and see what we have. All righty? So, Mr. Ritter.
preaching tomorrow morning, of course. So when you come to share what we've done in this workshop with the Hilltop Congregation, Pastor Tracy will be there to support us and give us the message.
Amen. Amen. Amen.
People in this room know we're not getting here with music.
Amen. Amen. That's right. That's right.
Yeah. And that's why
And the
we're
gospel
here.
in the music.
That's why we are here together as this group. We are called to do something special.
That's right.
So you have 10 minutes.
Amen.